Thank you, Dr. Lumen. Before you come and talk to me about the Oxford Institute for Wesleyan Studies, you should be advised it actually no longer exists. So that'll make that conversation short. First of all, I do just want to say thank you to all of you, to the seminary community, for making me feel so welcome here in these first few months I have been on the job. And to those who were here during the summer, just the skeleton staff crew and the maintenance guys and so on, who helped me find my way around and get everything I needed. Genuinely do appreciate it. Everyone has given such a warm welcome, and I really, really do appreciate it. Thank you for that. This morning we're going to be looking in the book of Acts, chapter 16, to a very, very familiar, brief little account. Acts chapter 16, verses 6 through 10, the account of Paul's Macedonian call. Paul and his companions traveled throughout the region of Phrygia and Galatia, having been kept by the Holy Spirit from preaching the word in the province of Asia. When they came to the border of Mysia, they tried to enter Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus would not allow them to. So they passed by Mysia and went down to Troas. During the night, Paul had a vision of a man of Macedonia standing and begging him, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." After Paul had seen the vision, we got ready at once to leave for Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. This passage has long been a favorite of mine for very, very practical reasons, very personal reasons. During the years of ministry and the twists and turns and just different directions the Lord has led, like I suppose everybody else, I have always wrestled with that question at times: is this God's will? How do I know this is what I'm supposed to do? And over the years, this has become my go-to text when I'm in the middle of those decision-making processes. When that question is in my mind and trying to sort out where I am and where I'm supposed to be going, this is a passage I come back to. Because in it, I think, from Paul's experience, we see some very helpful and very practical ways that the Lord does help us to understand and to know. It's a text I've once again gone back to for study and reflection just in the months leading up to the decision-making process that's brought me here. As always, it wasn't an easy decision, but yet, in a sense, it was, because of the sense of the clarity of the Lord saying, yes, this is where I want you to be. What's ironic about my deep appreciation for so long with this passage is that as a kid, I was never particularly impressed with the Apostle Paul. I remember basically knowing three things about him from Sunday school and just the teaching and the children's books that we read growing up in the church. First of all was the Damascus Road experience, the conversion experience. Second story was the Macedonian call. And the third experience was the one which follows later on in this 16th chapter when Paul and Silas are in jail. They've been beaten, they've been flogged, put in the stocks, thrown into jail, and in the middle of the night they're singing praises to God and the whole story that follows and surrounds that. I did give Paul credit for the jail incident. That was impressive. But the other two, frankly, I was not particularly impressed with. And the reason was very simple. In my kid's mind, it seemed too easy. I mean, come on. If Jesus would come and knock me off my bike one day with a blinding light and speak to me, I'd have a pretty quick conversion experience too. What's so noble about that? If as a child, Dr. Easley would have appeared to me in a vision. Said, "Come to Jackson." I'd have been here 40 years ago waiting for all of you. But the fact is, as a kid, it just seemed too easy. In other words, why did God do it this way with Paul? What made Paul so special in that? course, as I got older and learned, there's more to the story than that. You learn that there is a great deal going on here. But still, even long into adulthood, often had to wrestle with that question that most of you probably have wrestled with, and even whether or not you're supposed to be here. And that is, how do I know God's will? Why does it have to be so difficult? God, if you have something you want to say, why don't you just say it like you did with Paul? Why can't you make it easy on me the way you seem to make it so easy on him? The Lord gave me a very unique answer to that question in 1988. In the vice presidential campaign debates, if you don't remember it, you've probably heard about it and seen clips. That famous exchange between the vice presidential candidates, Lloyd Bentsen and Dan Quayle. Senator Bentsen, the elder statesman, years of experience and so on and so forth. Dan Quayle, the young upstart, the relatively new senator, young in age, who was derided for his lack of experience in his youth. And in that debate between the two candidates, when Senator Quayle was trying to justify and build up his stature, and he tried the ploy of comparing himself to John Kennedy, pointing out that when John Kennedy became president, he was about the same age that Dan Quayle was then and had about the same kind of experience. And of course, Senator Bentsen was just laying in wait for it. And he came back and he said, I knew John Kennedy. I worked with John Kennedy. And you, Senator, are no John Kennedy. And there have been times the Lord's brought that exchange to my mind. And I've said, why don't you, come on, step up to the plate, God, and talk to me the way you did to Paul? And he says, you guessed it, I knew the Apostle Paul. I worked with the Apostle Paul. And Dan, you're a nice enough guy, but you're no Apostle Paul, so get over yourself. Worry less about how I chose to deal with him and focus more on how I'm choosing to deal with you. But still, that left me with the question, what is it about Paul that enabled him to have this kind of experience? Why was it he was in such a position to so clearly have God's will revealed to him? And is there anything in there that really can apply to mere mortals like the rest of us? Actually, I think in this brief account of the Macedonian call, and really a whole pattern through Paul's life, we can identify some things about him that brought him to this point, without which the call never would have been experienced. I put it in 5 terms. I'm going to put them up here on the screen just to give you something to look at. The first factor about Paul is the fact that he saw God's will as a path rather than a target. Somewhere along the line, Paul had understood something that I had missed when I was a kid, and that is the matter of God's will is a matter of walking in a path rather than seeing a tiny pinpoint target out there that I have one shot to either hit or miss. Paul's journey, this missionary journey, began without the slightest clue that there was actually a target in mind on God's part. It was just a journey. It was a path he was pursuing. He began without the slightest idea that God was going to take him to Macedonia. In this case, God actually did have a specific target, but Paul was well along the journey before that was made known to him. In fact, he probably thought he was pretty much at the end of the journey. He kind of reached the edge of the world before God let him know where he was going. Ralph Earl, in his commentary on Acts, he describes this. He says it's as if Paul is walking down a long corridor. It's got all these doors on the right and the left, but none of them will open for him. Tries one, tries another, keeps going, reaches the end of the hallway, and about the time he thinks, now what do I do? All of a sudden, a door opens in front of him that he didn't even know was there. Not a door that he had pushed open, but a door that had been opened from the inside by God's hand. And it was there he discovered a whole new vast arena that God was really leading him into. I know in my own life sometimes I've struggled to discern God's will because I've wanted to know the end of the story before I'm willing to take the first step of the journey. I want my ducks all lined up in a row. I want to know everything. I want to have the details worked out. But until we're willing to, like Paul, begin the journey, not necessarily going to know where we're going. Paul was eventually in a position to know God's will because he first started the journey. Secondly, and very closely related to it, just kind of flows from it, is the second fact that Paul was already doing what he already knew to do. This is simply a matter of obedience. It's pretty common sense stuff, actually. There's no rocket science here. He was in a position to understand God's will for the future because he was walking in obedience to the light he had already received. It's a matter of connecting the dots. Had he never been obedient in the first place to the Spirit's prompting to embark on this missionary enterprise, he never would have been in a position to receive the call. He was only given light by God after he had proved that he was obedient to the previous light. It's the old step at a time, moving in what we do know rather than obsessing over what we don't know. It's in those times when I've struggled and seemed to have problem working through God's direction. I've had to ask myself some honest and difficult questions. Lord, am I already doing everything I do know to do? Is there ongoing sin in my life? First of all, is there some kind of relationship issue or other issue that needs to be healed or patched up or worked out before you're ready to tell me what's next? Am I really resistant maybe to where I think you are leading me? A whole host of questions. But it all comes down to the matter. As Paul's experience, he was already doing what he knew to do. Very closely related to that is a third fact about Paul. He was prepared to step up to the next assignment. He was in a position to have God's will revealed for him because God knew he was ready for it. He had proved himself faithful through years of service. His integrity was intact. His heart was intact. His trustworthiness, his loyalty, his obedience. All of these things had been demonstrated through thick and thin, through good times and bad. And God knew Paul was a man who can handle the job. He's proved himself ready. He has been faithful in everything else up to this point, so now we can move him through. And again, in those times when I've struggled with those questions of God's leading, Lord, why don't you make it clear? Why don't you make it more obvious to me? I've had to ask myself the question, am I ready? Am I trying to impose my time frame on God's agenda? Am I willing to wait until he sees that everything is in place? Oh, we all wish we knew the future, don't we? I don't anymore. I used to. When I started out in ministry 30 years ago, I wished I knew everything of where I was going and where God was going to lead. And in my mind, it was all justified so I could be prepared and I could be getting ready for it. And now I say, thank you, Lord, for not showing me where I've been over the last 30 years. Not that it's been that horrible, but if he had shown me things 30 years ago that I had been through since, I never would have started. I would have been intimidated. I would have been afraid of it. I would have said, there's no way, Lord, I can do that. I would have been almost, you have the wrong guy. Surely there's somebody else. And so he doesn't show us long range for our own good. He says, prove yourselves capable in the little things, and the big things will come along later. Let's take care of this issue now. And that serves as a building block for the next issue that's going to come along. I thank the Lord that he didn't show me all the things I've been through. Not only because I wouldn't have done it, but all the blessings I would have missed out on. All the great things he has done, the wonderful people I've come to know, the great experiences I have had, and just that walk and relationship with him. I would have cheated myself out of all of that if I had insisted on saying, Lord, show me the whole package before I'm willing to start. But instead, it's a matter of proving ourselves ready, a step at a time, doing the little things. Number 4, very important, Paul was familiar with the voice of God. I think this is so central and so key to this whole thing. He was in a position to understand God's will for the future because he lived so closely to God that he was acquainted with how God spoke and how God worked. And so somehow in that he is able to discern that this vision in the middle of the night really is of God and not just that late night pizza coming back to haunt him. There is reality in this. He was able to conclude that this vision was from God because he was simply familiar with God at that very intimate level, that he was able to recognize when God was speaking and leading. Like most people, well, put it this way, like most males, I assume at least. I won't speak for the ladies. But like most men, I think, I didn't know there was such a thing as babies sounding different from each other when they cried. Before I was a parent, a baby's cry was a baby's cry. You've heard one, you've heard them all. It was just kind of a standard thing. It first dawned on me that this whole episode of recognizing those things, even when I was a kid. I remember once being in a store with my mother. It was a store we had in our hometown called the Giant Store, which probably wasn't any bigger than this room, but that was before Walmart. And it did seem giant to me. And I remember one day being in that store, and I heard a kid over on aisle 3 or whatever yell out, "Mom!" And I heard a mother over on aisle 7 say, "Here I am." And I distinctly remember that experience because I thought, how does she know that's her kid? This place is full of moms. Why don't they all answer? They're all named Mom. But only one mom answered. Well, after I became a parent, I understood. You do learn the difference in the voices. You do learn the difference in the cry. When our first daughter, Julianne, was born, it was on a Monday morning, and I had the thrill of spending all day Monday with her and holding her and being with her, and went home that night and came back to the hospital the next morning. And as soon as the elevator door opened and I walked out onto the floor, I heard one baby crying in that whole ward. And I said, "That's my baby. That's not just any baby. That's my baby. I hope she's okay." And I followed the sound, and sure enough, I walked to where Julianne was crying. And I realized then there is a difference in the cry. The difference is I didn't ever have that relationship with any other baby. I spent just that one day with this baby. And the level of intimacy was so deep and so real that imprint was on my own heart. And so I never again mistook her voice for somebody else's. And I've had to admit that when I've struggled to work through this matter of God's will, so often it's come back to the matter. I have become unfamiliar with the voice of God. When I'm honest with myself and I look at my life, I say, "Lord, forgive me. I've drifted from the intimacy. I've not been close enough to you to recognize your voice." The problem isn't God not speaking. The problem was I wasn't hearing. Either because I wasn't listening, because I was so busy and so distracted with other things, or just because I wasn't close enough. And all of those times I was complaining to God because he wouldn't shout at me to tell me what he wanted me to do. I had no idea that God rarely shouts. God speaks in whispers. And he does that on purpose, because if you want to hear somebody whisper, what do you have to do? You got to get close. you have to make an effort to hear. You have to tune out the other things that are going on. And you actually have to kind of lean in. Whispering is a very up-close and personal form of communication. God likes to speak in whispers. But so often I know my own attitude has been, Lord, if you have something you want me to know badly enough, here I am. It's up to you to get my attention. And in those times, I never hear from him. Not because he isn't speaking, but because I haven't been listening. And a fifth factor about Paul that is so helpful, he practiced the art of daily surrender. He was in a position to understand God's will for the future because he knew what it was to yield to God today. The relationship is right there in front of us. In fact, that's really what's going on here in this passage about the Macedonian call. The thing that strikes me about the Macedonian call is not the vision and the call. It's the verses that come before it. And what's going on and what's brought Paul to that point. What's Luke say? That when Paul took off on this journey, where did he plan to go? It says he was headed west to the province of Asia. But he was stopped by the Lord and instead was directed northwest. And as he Paul thought, well, okay, we'll go that way. And then he says, Paul decides, well, we'll continue on north up into Bithynia. But again, the Spirit stops him and directs him back westward until he finally reaches the coastal town of Troas. Again, Paul is not imposing his own agenda in any of this. It is a matter of continual, daily surrender. Well, Lord, I thought I knew where I was going, but no, again, it's the journey. We've come this far. Which way do we go now? Again, most of us don't like to go on a journey without knowing where we're going. Years ago, when I was working at our denominational headquarters, I found myself in the car one day, headed off cross country with one of our denominational executives, and we were headed down into Georgia someplace. And to my horror, discovered that he had no road map. I hardly leave my backyard without a road map. I just want to know where I am. And I couldn't believe this guy had no maps of any kind. He says, well, I think I know where we're going. We'll find it. Well, that worked most of the time, but not all the time. We did lose a lot of time, both there and coming back on that trip. We want to know where we're going, but Paul says, I'll surrender. I'll give up the road map. You take it, Lord. He wouldn't have received the call to Macedonia if he had not already been in the practice of that daily surrender. Of course, that means a matter of making God's agenda my agenda, not the other way around, making God's priorities my priorities rather than the other way around, making God's time schedule my time schedule instead of the other way around. And actually, this, too, is the key to the whole thing, I think. It's this matter of this daily surrender is what really sums up the whole experience that Paul is having here. And it's really what sums up all of these other factors going into it. Because the fact is, just as God rarely whispers, the fact is God rarely issues a Macedonian-style call. God rarely hands us full-blown plans with easy-to-follow instructions. Instead, he speaks to us in more subtle ways. He leads us through gentle nudges, quiet whispers, slightly open doors, sometimes just through common sense. But by whatever means he chooses to lead us, nothing can happen without the practice of daily surrender. It's that daily surrender that gives the perspective of God's will in this big picture as opposed to this tiny little target. It's that daily surrender that enables obedience. It's that daily surrender that makes us ready for the next assignment. It's that daily surrender that keeps us so close to him. We can hear the whisper and recognize the divine call. 18 centuries after Paul, John Wesley correctly understood the importance of the daily surrender. Profound importance. Because we talk often about Wesley's definition of holiness as being this matter of loving God with your heart, soul, mind, strength, and neighbors yourself, which is true. But so often we don't talk about Wesley's emphasis on the dailiness of that renewal, the dailiness of that surrender, the dailiness of that reaffirmation of that walk with the Lord. And Wesley understood the essence of it so well, and it's expressed so well in that well-known prayer from his covenant service. He says, Lord, I am no longer my own, but yours. Put me to what you will. Rank me with whom you will. Put me to doing. Put me to suffering. Let me be employed for you